Today's daf we're going to be learning is Shevuot, Daf Lamed Hey. Today's daf is sponsored by Abishag Edry for refuah shlema and rescue of Alon ben Idit. We're going to get started. We're going to finish the bottom of our daf from yesterday, the last section of why they mocked him. If you remember, yesterday's daf was all based on four different opinions about how we know that Shevuot HaEdut is specifically in a case of only Tviat Mamon, only money, monetary issues, and not other cases. And again, that means if you deny testimony in something else, not having to do with monetary cases, you won't be obligated. The Korban Olav Yored if you lied under oath. And then we had this fourth opinion of Rabbi Shimon. There was a very long-winded opinion. First, we're going to compare to Shevuot to Pikadon. That's money. This is money. Then we're going to say it's even a Kal Chomer. Then he said, oh, it's not a Kal Chomer. The Kal Chomer is no good because there's actually differences, and Shevuot to Pikadon is actually limited. And one of the main things, and this is the one we're going to discuss now, is that you're not liable in a mazy case. Okay, in a case of intentional, even though you are in shogeg, that's a unique opinion. Most people think Shevuot Pikadon is mazid, but Rabbi Shimon said not. And then we said, okay, and then he goes and says, in the end, oh, it's Gzera Shava. And that's where we learn it from the Shevuot Pikadon through Gzera Shava. So then we ended yesterday. The rabbis in Israel mocked his opinion and said, oh, it's ridiculous. And the question is, what did they think was ridiculous? And we're actually not going to be successful in figuring out, which is interesting, right? You have the Babylonians who are trying to understand what the people in Eretz Israel didn't understand about Rabbi Shimon, and they're not successful in understanding. But if you remember, what we got to yesterday was, where does he get? First, we thought maybe it was ridiculous that he says Shvuat Pikadon is only shogeg, not mazid. So in the end, they said, we're going to learn it from Me'ilah. We're going to learn it from, because it says, Ma'alam al Ba'ashem. From there, we learn that Shvuat HaPikadon is only shogeg, and that's why it's different than Shvuat HaEdut. Okay? And that's where we got to. So we concluded by saying, then we have a whole list. Why is it similar to Me'ilah in more ways than it's similar to Shevuot HaEdut? But now we're going to say, wait a minute. Maybe that's what was ridiculous. In other words, now that we explain that it comes from Me'ilah and that Shogeg is only the only case you're going to be chayav in Pikadon is Shogeg because Me'ilah is only Shogeg. So now the Gemara says, now remember, also he says there's a Gzera Shava between Pikadon and Edut. Now, Gzera Shavas work in both directions. Meaning, if you're going to learn from Pikadon to Edut, which was what we were trying to do, you can also learn from, from Edut to Pikadon, which is what we were trying to do, and say, well, if that's Mazid, that should be Mazid. But oh no, but we're going to learn from Me'ilah the Mazid. It's not in a case of Mazid. But theoretically, you could have learned from Edut to Pikadon that it was intentional also. Now they say, well, if you have Gzera Shava and you learn the case of Pikadon from Me'ilah, and Pikadon is only in a case of Shogeg, in unintentional, and you won't be liable for intentional. Again, only according to Rabbi Shimon. V'tehadar eduda, 3 lines from the bottom now in Lamedalet and Mebet. Why don't we then say tehadar edu v'tigmar lami pikadon? Well, if we have the Gzera Shava comparing pikadon to edut and edut to pikadon, why don't we now say, maybe edut, something we thought was so obvious, that edut is intentional. And why did we think it was so obvious? Because remember, it didn't say the words v'ne'elam. It didn't say, and you forgot. But maybe from the Gzera Shava, we should be learning, and maybe that's what they thought was ridiculous. If you're going to learn from Me'ilah to Pikadon, then you should learn from there all the way back to Edut. And then you would come to the conclusion that Edut, that if what you're saying is right, they say to him in Eretz Israel, in other words, we're putting words in their mouths. But if what you're saying is right, that Pikadon is only Shogeg, then once we have the Gzera Shava, learn back from Pikadon to Edut, and then say, right, Mezi delav keshogeg. Mezi delav keshogeg. Why don't you learn that it's Mezid is not like shogeg? Ma pikadon shogegi mezid lo. Just like pikadon, you're only liable if it's a case of unwitting shgaga. Af edut shogegi mezid lo. Ki echad yelav pikadon mi'ila. Okay, that's what we just said. Since you're going to learn pikadon to mi'ila, learn from pikadon to edut. And then what you're saying is ridiculous because what? You're going to now come and say that according to this, you should say that edut is only in a case of shgaga, which we know it's not. Okay, so your drasha has a problem in it. And that's assuming the last explanation we took, which is that they were learning the whole, when they said shogeg is not like mazid, it's learned out from Me'ilah, and then because of the Gzera Shava between Pikadon and Edut, we should move that all the way back to Edut. So they say no. Lahachi katva rachmana, that's not really difficult because you could say we're going to learn from Pikadon, from Pikadon from Me'ila. And Pikadon's only Shkaga. And yes, we have Gzeira Shava back to Edu, but we're not going to learn this issue through the Gzeira Shava. Why? Because we have a different reason from the Psukim to make it clear that we know that Edu is intentional. How so? That we're going to say based on its placement in the Torah. Remember, we've looked at this parak a few times. The beginning of the parak has the three things that you're chayav a korban olav yored, which is what we thought originally why it was mentioned there. Shevuot edu, Shevuot bitoy, tumat mikdash v'kodeshav, right? Everything we've learned in this Masechet so far. Now, in all those cases, now we thought it was there because of the korban olav yored, and later in the chapter we hear about Shevuot pikadon. Now, theoretically, it could have been listed with Shevuot pikadon, and then maybe we could have done this whole thing and said, really, it's only, even though it doesn't say b'nei elam, also by pikadon it didn't say b'nei elam, and right, elam means shkaga. It doesn't say it, but it could still be only shkaga. But the Torah specifically put this next to Tumat Mikdash and next to Shevuot Bitoy, to Bekula ne'amar b'hem b'nei elam, Bekan lo ne'amar b'hem b'nei elam, l'chayev al hamizik k'shogeg. The placement specifically was to teach you this is different from the other two. In other words, on the one hand, it's putting it in the same place because it's the same category. On the other hand, it's highlighting the differences between them. If it just didn't say b'nei elam somewhere else, okay, maybe we wouldn't come to that conclusion. But because it's next to the two cases where it specifically says b'nei elam, b'nei elam, b'nei elam, right? It's mentioned even 3 times because in Tumat Mikdash it's mentioned 2 times, and then once by Shevuot Bitoy. From there, we learn that this clearly isn't mazid, and that's why that couldn't be what was bothering them in Israel, and we're left without an answer to our question. Now, starting with the next Mishnah. This Mishnah has 5 sections to it. It's going to be a very simple structure and actually pretty simple content until we get to the next Mishnah. We have basically a list of 5 cases where you're not going to be liable for an edut, each one for a different reason. The Mishnah, the Gemara, is then going to go into each of the 5 cases in order, and then it's going to say what they're going to bring a midrash halacha. What's always the difference between a midrash halacha and a Mishnah? Usually the Mishnah doesn't bring the source, the midrash halacha brings the source. So other than one, we're going to do something a little bit more than that. Otherwise, it's just going to be bringing the drasha where we get it from. So first case, mashbi'ani alechem. Okay, so we're going to have all sorts of languages of someone making someone else take an oath for Shevuot Eidud. Im lo tavo v'tiyiduni shamar ish ploni li'ten li 200 zuz v'lo natan. You saw testimony that someone said, I'm going to give a gift to somebody else. And then that person who was supposed to get the gift says, hey, come and testify that so-and-so said they were giving me a gift. And they didn't. Now, that's not a claim. First of all, if the person says they were going to give you a gift and then they change their mind, of course, they could always change their mind. And it's not like that gift has your name on it until you get it. So until they've given it, it's not yours. And therefore, it has to be similar to a pikadon. What's a pikadon case? I have something of yours on my property, and I claim it's mine. And you say, what are you talking about? It's mine, right? You say, that is mine, and it's in your property. That's the kind of, now, when it's a gift, it's not yours in someone else's property, okay? It's their money. They want to give it to you as a gift, they can. But that's not Shevuot Eidud. Case 2. Okay. In the future, if you know, right, I'm making you swear now that if in the future you know testimony for me, you will promise that you'll come forward and testify. Hare elu ptulim. If they took an oath about it and then saw testimony and then didn't, they're not going to be liable. Because the Shevuot came before the testimony. Again, how we know that this can't be, we're going to see in the Psukim later. Amad bebeit knesset. You get up in the shul. Okay, beit knesset in the Mishnah is known as a shul. Kinus, it comes from kinus, a place of gathering. It just means, and obviously doesn't have to be only in a shul, you got up in a big place and you said to a huge number of people or a bunch of people, it doesn't matter how many, any more than the witnesses actually, and you said, Mashbi'ani alechem shematem yudim li'edut shetavo v'tiyiduni. I'm making you all take an oath that if you know testimony for me, you will come testify, right? And, or then, hare elu p'turin ad she'em tkaven lahen. If you make them take an oath in this way and they all say, we don't know testimony for you, and 2 of them happen to be your witnesses, well, they're all exempt because that's not a Shevuot Eidud. Amar l'shnayim, mashbi'ani alechem ish ploni u'ploni she'ematem yudim li'edut shetavo v'tiyiduni. And then they say, Shevuot she'enan yudim l'chaydud. Okay, so far there's just a regular case of Shevuot Eidud. They say, I swear, you should swear that you have testimony. And they say, we don't have any testimony. That's a Shevuot Eidud. But in this case, V'hem yodim lo edut eid mipi eid. They have hearsay evidence. They heard someone else say, but they weren't actually the witnesses. So that's not a shvuat edut because they can't actually testify in court. O shayach hamim karov or pasul, or one was a relative of the person trying to get them to testify for them. Hare elu ptulin. So again, they'll be exempt. Case 5, this we saw already. Shilach b'yad avdo. He sent his slave, Canaanite slave, or Osha amar lahem anikdba. The other party to the case came and said, Mashbi'a ani alechem she'im atem yod'im lo edut shetavo v'tiyidu. I don't know why the other side would ever want to do this, but the other side says, listen, you take an oath that you should come, testimony, come to court for the other side. Okay, so then again, say there's an exemption here. It has to be, and we learned this before, that the person who wants them to testify for that person has to be the one to bring them in. It's not enough, okay, to have someone else do it for them. Okay, now we did say they could have a shaliach. Shaliach operates like them, but the eved doesn't count as a shaliach because it's an eved knani. Or someone, if the other side brings in the witnesses or tries to bring them in, that doesn't work either. Okay, where we get this all from, we're going to learn inside. So now we're going to start in the Gemara. Tanu Rabbanan. So the first case is the case of the gift, which is not a real claim. Tanu Rabbanan. So here comes a braita. Mashbiani alechem lo tavo v'tiduni shamar yishplan l'tein l'matayim zuz v'lonatan. Exactly our case. Yachol yu chayavim. You might have thought you'd be liable, right? This is the difference between the Mishnah and the Midrash Halakha. The Midrash Halakha answers the question. You might have thought you'd be chayav. Talmud lamal. Therefore, the pasuk says, what's the drasha? Techta l'gzera shava. Again, we're back to this famous gzera shava between pikadon and edut. Has to be similar to pikadon. Ne'amar kan techta v'ne'amar lalang techta. It says techta by edut. It says techta by pikadon, by the deposit. Ma lahalam b'tviat mamon v'yeshlo. Okay, before we just learned tviat mamon. It has to be a monetary claim, but now it's more so. It's a monetary issue, and yeshlo. The person has the item in their possession that belongs to somebody else. It has to be that the money is in the other person's hands and not that the money's all in the hands of one person and, it all belongs to them and it's just a matter, do they make a commitment to give a gift? Okay, case 2. This is future. When you know testimony from me, you'll come forward later. Tanu Rabbanan, again, same structure. You might have thought you'd be liable. Talmud lamal v'sham'a kol Allah, which is the oath. V'hu eid o ra'ah yada. Now, how does it describe this? You are sworn in about testimony, but you were already a witness. Either you knew or you saw. So what do you see here? Mishkan ma'idut l'shvuah. The edut has to come first, then the oath. V'lo shekad ma'shvuah le'edut. Not that the oath came before you even had testimony. 3. Amar b'beit hakneset. You're in a public space. Okay, here we're going to have a little something different. It's not going to be just what's the source, but we're going to have a halach of Shmuel about this. Amar Shmuel, afilu edav benehem. Even if the edim are in the room, when you went to the shul and said, everybody swear, and everybody said, we don't know testimony, and your 2 witnesses were there. Okay, so the Gemara now asks the obvious question, which is Pshita, what's Shmuel adding? Of course they were in the room. If they weren't in the room, what would we be talking about? If I spoke to a random group of people who had no knowledge of testimony and I said, can you all testify for me? And they all said, no, we swear we don't know testimony. Of course they're not liable. No one was even lied. But obviously it's when the edim were there. So why is Shmuel saying this? So they say, Lo tzricha dekai ilavayhu. But the case is, let's say I go into a shul and I say, I swear you all, if you know testimony for me, come forward. And I'm standing right next to the 2 witnesses. And it's clear that I'm really talking to them, even though I say everybody. Okay? So, maybe it's like I'm talking to them directly. Kamash no, because in the end I said everybody, and therefore it's everybody. And now we're going to have a braita to prove this. And within this braita, we're going to get to our source, like we've been looking for all the other ones. See a group of people, right, standing there, and the edav are there, and perhaps it even means benehem, right next to him. And then he says, I swear, right, make you all swear that you know, right? If you know testimony from me, come forward. Yachol yu chayavim, you might have thought they'd be liable. Talmud lamar v'hu aid. And why do we learn it from v'hu aid? And what does it say? He is the witness. Hare lo yiched edav. What does it mean v'hu aid? He was a designated witness, and not only designated witness for the actual occurrence, but designated now with the oath. Okay, there was no designation in that case. Just said to everybody without designating. Maybe you would think that if you said everybody here and you did single them out because you said everybody here, that's not exactly singling out. Okay, has to be really singling out and not singling out everybody. Singling out everybody doesn't work. Amar l'shnayim. Case 4. Mashbi'ani alechem. Tanu Rabbanan. Amar l'shnayim. This is the case where they have hearsay testimony or they're related. Mashbi'ani alechem ploni. Ploni matem yodim le'edut shtavo v'tiduni. I make you swear. If you know testimony, come forward. Vehem yodim le'edut mipi'ed. It's hearsay. O she'acha mehem karov u'pasul. Or their relatives. Yachol yu chayavim. You might have thought they'd be liable. Talmud lomar. Im lo yagid v'nasavu no. If you don't tell it, then you will have iniquity upon you. Now, what is it if you don't tell it? What does that mean? It means it has to be beruyim la'agadah ketub medaber. It has to be someone who could tell it. These people can't tell it because either they didn't actually see it themselves, or they're relatives of the claimant, or something like that. Okay. 5. Shilach biyad avdo. Tanu Rabbanan. Here we're going to bring another braita. Shilach biyad avdo o shamar lem anitba. Right. The other side says mashbiani alechem she'im atem yodim lo edud. Right. You know testimony for the other person, you'll come forward. Right. Again, I don't know why anyone would ever do this. Why someone would make someone swear to actually come and testify for the other side. It's not in their best interest. But if they were to do this, yachol yu chayavim, you might have thought they're liable because in the end they were sworn to give testimony for this case. Talmud lamal im lo yagiv v'nasavo. No, it is a good example where you get to this and you say, "What? Where did you get it from there?" Okay, and there ends the braita. And if you don't go on in the Gemara, you could get stuck on this and sit and think, "Whoa, what?" and spend a long time. But the Gemara, sometimes when you get stuck, you have to just go forward to the next words. The Gemara says, "My Talmuda, how did you get it from the pasuk?" They didn't understand how they got it from the pasuk. So Amar Rabbi Elazar, they bring what Rabbi Elazar came and explained. Im lo yagid ktiv. Now you have to look inside to understand this, or I'll tell you outside if you're not looking. Which is lo yagid. Lo is spelled im lo yagid. If you don't say, it should be lamed aleph. But it's spelled lamed vav aleph. Now the word lo, lamed vav, we're now going to say that lo with the vav and with the aleph is actually, it's like a drasha that we can read it in both ways. Lo with a vav is to him, and lo with an aleph is not. So now they're going to read it both ways. They're going to say like this: Im lo yagid v'nasavo. No, if to him you don't say. Now who's to him? To the claimant who wants you to testify for them. V'im la'acher lo yagid patur. But if it's to anybody else and not lo, to that person, like the other side or anyone random person who brings you to court, well, then you're not going to be liable. Okay, there ends that section. Now we're going to move on to the next Mishnah, which is going to talk about languages of Shevuah, that it has to be in some sort of language like this in order for it to be considered an oath. And what constitutes an oath? So, mashbi'ani alechem mitzavani alechem osarchem ani. Hare'elu chayavim. If you say, I make you swear, I'm commanding to you, or I'm osil. What's osil? Remember, we learned the lashon of isul, suri saral nafshe. It's another language, a synonym of Shevuah. Hare'elu chayavim. Okay, we're going to talk about this language as soon as we get to the Gemara. Where's the real oath here? It doesn't really say oath. We'll get back to that. B'shamayim uva'aretz. If you say, right, you're taking an oath in the heavens and the earth, hare'elu p'turim. You're exempt. That's not a kind of oath. We're going to see now that it seems, and most of the commentaries understand it this way, in order for it to be considered an oath, you have to say, you have to use the name of God. And there's a whole question, oaths in general. Do all oaths need the name of God? Do they not? What oaths do, what oaths don't? So here it seems to indicate that you need the name of God. And therefore, Shemayim and Aretz are not the name of God, and the heavens and the earth is not God. But ba'alef daled b'yud hey b'shadai b'tzvaot b'chanum v'rachum b'erech hapayim b'rav chesed b'chol ha'kinuyim hare'elu chayavim. If you use any sort of name of God, okay, whether it's alef daled, that's Adonai, yud hey, yud kei vav kei, right, the Shema Mefurash, Shaddai, Tzvaot, Chanum v'rachum, okay, God is merciful, and right, those words that describe God, erech hapayim, slow to anger, Rav chesed, full of chesed for everyone. Any name of God, hare'elu chayavim. Hamakalel b'chulan chayav divrei Rabbi Meir v'chachamim potri. Okay, if you curse God and you use any one of these names, so Rabbi Meir says you're going to be liable. The Chachamim exempt, because if you remember, there's this opinion that only if you use the Shem HaMeforash, the special name of God, the Yud Kei Vav Kei, not the other ones. And likewise, Hamakalel Aviv Imo, if you curse your parents in the name of God, you're chayav if you use any of these. Divrei Rabbi Meir. So we're basically taking this topic of nicknames of God and applying it to a totally different situation, okay, to cursing. Cursing both in cursing God and cursing someone using the name of God. Chachamim potrim, same thing about Makalel Aviv Imo. The Chachamim say no, it's only Shem HaMeforash. Hamakalel atzmo v'chavero bikulan over below taseh. If you curse yourself or someone else using the name of God or any of these kinuyim, that's a lo taseh. Okay, the first ones were death penalty. Death penalty, we're going to have this machloket. Do you have to use Shem HaMeforash or not? When it's just a negative commandment, a lo taseh, so then you're going to be liable with even, nobody has a machloket about it. You're going to have transgressed this negative commandment. Okay, another language of oath. Yakecha Hashem Elohim, v'chein yakecha Elohim, zoi Allah k'tuba b'Torah. And when it talks about this Allah, it says, Shema kol Allah, the Allah written in the Torah is, okay, now, what does this mean? Well, if you say, so Rashi says, I'm just going to read it inside Rashi, you'll see. Zoi Allah, im amar le'idim echad min ha'mikraot shebeklalot. That's where we got this from. It's one of the psukim in the klalot in the Torah, the curses that God's going to bring upon you. Yikacha Hashem b'shachefet, for example. Im lo ti'iduni, okay? If you don't write it's a long pasuk. Yikacha Hashem b'shachefet, b'kadacha, b'daleka, b'charchar, b'cherev, b'shitafon, okay, all that. Im lo ti'iduni, in other words, God will smite you if you don't do this. So since, okay, any of those things, since it's like, they say, it's as if he read the Klal in the Torah and said, Ken yikacha im lo ti'iduni, okay? God will, just like God promised in the curses, that God will curse the Jewish people, likewise you will be cursed like that if you don't testify for me. Okay? And then, how do we know that's Allah? Because it says there, Kechol alot habrit. Okay, so because it mentions these in the context of alot, so therefore this must be the same Allah. So this would also be another way of the curse being a curse. Okay, al yikacha v'yibracha v'yativ lecha. What if you say, God won't curse you if you testify for me? Or God won't hit you if you testify for me, okay? Or God won't hit you, that's one. Or God will bless you if you testify for me, or God will do good for you if you testify for me. Now, Rabbi Meir says you're liable, but you didn't say the negative language, right? But if not, well, that's because we have a concept, seen this many times, michlal lavat hashomeahin. If you say God won't hit you if you testify for me, the opposite of that is God will hit you if you don't testify. And that already counts. But the rabbis say no, obviously, why not? Because they don't hold michlal lavat hashomeahin. You have to spell it out. We've seen this with conditions, right? Stipulations, you have to say them in both directions. Okay, there's machlokot about it. Can you say michlal lavat hashomeahin or not? So that's the machloket here. Okay, let's start with the Gemara. Mashbiani lechem. So the first problem is my kama. Like you didn't really say a language of oath in all these three. Amar Rav Yehuda hachi kamar. So he says what it means to say is like this. Mashbi'a ani alechem b'shvuah amura b'Torah. Tzaveh ani alechem b'tzavah amura b'Torah. Osarchem ani b'isura amura b'Torah. Well, by using these languages, mashbi'a, mitzaveh, osarchem, we're saying in like the language in the Torah where we have shvuah, we have a tzivui, we have an isal. Okay, it's basically saying I'm referencing this word from the Torah, which is an oath. Okay, so even though you don't explicitly say that, that's really what you mean. Amar le Abaye, wait, says this doesn't make sense because elahad tani Rabbi Chia kovachem ani hare elu chayavi. Kaval, kovel is like to tie. Now, an isur is also to tie. Okay, like lahatir asurim is to let them out, right? Asur is to tie. It's also to bind, right? It's like that. Koval is another word of like binding. So now they say in this Braita, it says kovalchem is also a language of Shevuot. Now, never says that word in the Torah. Can't be that when you say these languages, you mean referring to what it says in the Torah about them and that they're a language of oath. So if you go with this Braita, koval b'oraita miktiv, it doesn't say anywhere koval in the Torah. Ela Amar Abaye, so Abaye doesn't agree with Rabbi Yehuda about this. Abaye says no. Hachi kamar. What you're really saying is mashbi'an elechem b'shvuah, mitzavan elechem b'shvuah, osarchem ani b'shvuah, kolchem ani b'shvuah. What it means is you're saying I'm doing right. That's the verb, and the noun is in an oath. Okay, it kind of means that. Now we're getting to the names of God, and from here we're going to get into the topic of Daf Michelle Farber this week, which hasn't gone up for technical reasons, but should Be'ezrat Hashem go up today, assuming Maggie's computer gets better. So it's okay. It's not going to magically get better. It's getting fixed, but anyway. So now we have that, and the topic of Daf Michelle Farber this week. You can actually look at it. You can watch it in Hebrew at this already. Is the issue of erasing God's name. Okay, since we're already talking about God's name, kinuyim of God's name. We have this distinction in the Mishnah where when it comes to oaths, they're all one and the same. Question is it always one and the same? Are there differences between them? And now we're going to get off on a whole tangent about different names of God. So lememra de chanun v'rachum shemot ninu. Wait, this is saying if you say chanun or rachum, you mean God, because it just said you can take an oath in the name of that, and that would be like you took an oath in the name of God. You'll be liable. Urimini, but that contradicts the following source. There's certain names of God you can erase. There's certain names of God you can't erase. These are names of God you cannot erase. Kigon, and then the whole topic of Daf Michelle Farber really starts out with the geniza. What kind of papers can you throw out? What can't you throw out? It's a big, right, relevant topic. Kigon El, Elohecha, Elohim, Elohechem, Eheyeh Asher Eyeh, Aleph Daled, Yud Hey, Shaddai Tzvaot, Harei Elu Einim Chakim. Those are all names of God you cannot erase. Aval, Hagadol, Hagibor, Hanorah, Haadir, Hachazak, Haamitz, Haazuz, Chanun v'Rachum, Erech Apayim, Rav Chesed, Elu Nimchakim. But all these other ones actually can be erased. Okay, so now we say, notice what's here, Chanun v'Rachum. That's not a name of God. Our Mishnah is talking about someone who is chanun. Now, who is that? That's God. Okay, turning now to Amabet, b'mishu rachum kama. When it says chanun v'rachum, it doesn't mean just chanun v'rachum as adjectives. It's actually saying the person. It's talking about a noun. The person who is chanun, the person who is rachum. When you just have the word rachum written down or chanun written down, that could be erased. That's not God. But in our Mishnah, they mean if you say, I swear in chanun and rachum, what are you swearing in? You're not swearing in an adjective, you're swearing in a noun, and a person that's chanun rachum. No, not a person, but who is it? It's God. Okay. Amrli Rava, Ihachi, Shamayim v'aretz nami. Well, then why did Shamayim v'aretz not work in the Mishnah? Why do we say that's not an oath? You could say, if you're going to say it's not, right, chanun v'rachum is the person who is chanun v'rachum, why don't you say Shamayim v'aretz is b'misha Shamayim v'aretz shelo kamar? Maybe it means the one who the Shamayim v'aretz belong to, and that is God. So they say, no, you can't compare the two. First of all, notice one's an adjective, one's a noun. Okay, that's already a difference. Right? There is nothing that's called chanun v'rachum. There's no being, there's no something that's called chanun v'rachum. There's no object called chanun v'rachum. Therefore, vadai b'mishu chanun, vadai b'mishu rachum kamar. This is really saying it's an adjective. It's describing something or someone. So it must be, and since there's no thing that's described as chanun or rachum, right? It's not a trait for an object. It must be, it's talking about a being, that is. And what must that be? God. Hacha, but when it comes to Shemayim ba'aretz, the ika Shemayim ba'aretz, v'Shemayim ba'aretz kamar. Since there is a Shemayim, there is an aretz, there's heavens, there's earth. When you say, I swear in the heavens and the earth, maybe you really mean in the heavens and the earth, and not God. Okay, and therefore that's not really a problem. Tanu Rabbanan. Now we're going to talk about other things about erasing. Katav Aleph Lamed me Elohim, Yud He me Hashem, Harei ze eino nimchak, because Aleph Lamed, right, El, Yud He, right, that's also, those are both names of God. So even though you haven't erased the complete word, you've erased a word that in and of itself is the name of God. But Shin Daled Mishadai, Aleph Daled me Adonai, Tzadi Bet Mitzvaot, Harei ze nimchak. Those letters, those two letters, if you erase them, they don't mean anything. Sav, Ad, right? Those are not names of God. Shad, okay? Those are not anything, and therefore you can erase them. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Tzvaot Kulon Nimchak. You can actually erase the whole word Tzvaot. That's not a name of God. Shaloni Kat Tzvaot Ela Al Shem Yisrael. God is called Tzvaot, hosts, it means literally in English, because of the Jewish people. It's really a word for the Jewish people. Shenema, how do we know? Because the pasuk says, "V'hotzeti et tzivotai et ami b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim." I took out my host people, that's us from Egypt. Okay, Amar Shmuel and al Rabbi Yossi. Shmuel says we don't rule like that. But now, okay, we're going to get back to this soon, this idea that a word could mean God, it could mean something else. Okay, we're going to have a whole long digression about that in another minute. But before we get there, we're going to have another digression about what parts of words you can erase. We already discussed that, so now we're going to say Tanu Rabbanan. Kol atafel lashem, bein milefanav bein milacharav, harei ze nimchak. In the Hebrew language, okay, different than in English. I mean, in English you have prefixes and suffixes as well, but so I guess it's really the same. These are a little bit different because this is like a letter that's right. Be, bahashem, me'ashem, la'ashem, right? There's all these letters that you add one letter and it means, right? It's like a whole word. So they say the following. Anything that's not the name itself, but it's a prefix or a suffix, whether it's a prefix, milefanav, or whether it's la'acharav, a suffix, harei ze nimchak, you can erase it. Like, for example, they're going to give, I don't know why they're giving so many examples. By the time we get to the end of the list, okay, we got the point. Lifanav kitzad, lahashem, lamed nimchak, bahashem, bet nimchak, vahashem, vav nimchak, me'ashem, mem nimchak, shehashem, shin nimchak, he'ashem, he nimchak, ka'ashem, kaf nimchak. That was a lot of examples. Any letter before Hashem, like Hashem, Hashem, you can erase the kaf. La'acharav ketzad, Eloheinu, nun nimchak. Elohehem, hem nimchak. Elohechem, kem nimchak, right? You can go on, right? Elokeinu, right? There's a million different formulations, even not a million, but there's a whole bunch you could do. Okay, here they stopped a little early without giving every single one. But achirim omrim, la'acharav ino nimchak, shekvar kitsho Hashem. Once it's a suffix, the problem is that you already wrote the whole word by the time you got to the suffix, which means you already created a word that was sanctified. So you can't erase the end according to Rabbi Yos, according to Achirim. Can't erase the end of that word. The beginning you can, because when you wrote the Bahashem, you started with Bet, nothing was sanctified yet. You hadn't even written God's name. So even though you in the end write the whole name, you can get rid of the Bet. But the end, according to this opinion, you can't get rid of. And Amar Rav Huna halachak Achirim. And in fact, Rav Huna paskins like Achirim. Now we're going to get on, as I said, on a long digression about all sorts of places in the Torah. Okay, we're going to have Avram Dilatia, which is a reference to Lot, Linavot, Begivat Binyamin, Shlomo, Daniel. Okay, we're now going to have, there's a reference to a bunch of people. We're going to talk about characters in the Tanach, where sometimes they use the word or a word that would normally denote God's name, but it doesn't necessarily. Okay, and we're going to see sort of interesting. I think they're categorizing the people into good and bad people, perhaps. And the more good you are, it seems, the more when you use God's name, you really mean God's name. And in the bad places, right, the less good people, they often use God's name in a negative, not in a negative way, but it depends actually, but not actually referencing God. Okay, it's almost like saying there's people who, all their thoughts are about God. So when they say a word that could denote the name of God, they obviously mean God. And then there's people who aren't really with God all the time. And therefore, when they use the word, they don't really mean God. They mean, like Adonai, for example, could be my master, right? My master could be God. My master could be a person in a way of speaking in respect to a person. So that's what we're going to go through right now. Kol Hashemot, Amurim Torah Avram Kodesh. Okay, if we go by what I said, good person Avram, it's always Kodesh. Chutz mizeh shu chol, except for one reference, and now we're going to have a machloket actually about this reference. Shneimar, when the angels come and visit, it says, Vayomer Adonai imna matzati chem be'enecha, and then it says, Al na tavor me'al avdecha, don't pass by me, right? Don't leave. Okay, so it seems like there he's actually talking to the angels and calling them Adonai, which is not God. Chanina ben Achi, Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Mishum Rabbi Elazar Modei Amru. But these two rabbis, in the name of two other rabbis, said, or actually one is not in the name of the other rabbi, but one is Av Zeh Kodesh. That's even referring to God. Now, what did they mean? The angels come. If you remember, it starts off Parshat Vayera that God appeared to Avram, and then it says he saw these people coming, and he left to talk. Right, he goes to talk to the people. So when he speaks here, he's speaking to God, and he says, "Please don't leave me. I'm going to deal with it with the guests. I'll come back to you." Okay, which teaches you this big halacha, which we're going to see right now. So according to who, Keman Az Lahada Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, and Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, Gdolach Nasat Orchim Yoter Me'Akbalat Pnei Shechina. Right, greeting guests and bringing guests to your house is more important than greeting God. Kiman koto azuk. It's like that pair of rabbis, because that pair of rabbis understood that pasuk to be referring to God. And basically, Avram says to God, it's crazy, right? You wait here, I'm coming back, but I have to first deal with my guests. Okay? That's if you understand it's tying to God. If you understand it's tying to the angels, then it has nothing to do with God. Now, as opposed to Abraham, kol hashemot hamurim belot, ho. Okay, and here when he talks to the people in stone, okay, or there's all sorts of references. You can look up the psukim. We don't have time to go through all this, okay. And Rashi quotes a whole bunch of them, but all the times he says Adonai, he really means other people. Okay, chutz mizeh shu kodesh, shenemar vayom elot alehem. Okay, this is really, it sounds like he's saying, talking to the angels, but it says, Al na Adonai, hinena matzah avdecha chen be'inecha. I should find favor in your eyes. And you have to read the rest of the pasuk to understand, because they don't quote the important part. V'tigdal chastecha asher asiti madi, the chesed that I did with you should be great. La chayot et nafshi, to allow me to live. V'anochi lo uchal imale tahara, pentid b'keni ara avamati, right? If I start running to the mountain, I'm worried that the destruction of stone is going to get to me. So now, who is he talking to there? Misheyesh biyadola hamitu lachayot. Kadosh Baruch Hu. He's obviously talking to God, because God's the only one who has the power to let him live or die. So there, it's an obvious reference to God, but all the other references in Lot are not. Kol hashemot amurot bin navot. Okay, navot Yisraeli. Remember the whole story with Achav, are kodesh. B'micha chol. Okay, they don't really get into navot at all, but we are going to get into Micha. Micha is Pesel Micha. That's the guy who brings this idol in Sefer Shoftim. And there, obviously, all the references are to idols, because, right, Elohim Achirim is also the same word, means other gods. Okay, and therefore, Rabbi Eliezer Omer b'Navot Kodesh, b'Micha yesh me'em chol v'yesh me'em Kodesh. Okay, so now Rabbi Eliezer says in Navot it's Kodesh, but in Micha it's not only all the references in the Pesel Micha story, okay, which most of them are said by the Levite who works for him. Okay, so b'Micha yesh me'em chol v'yesh me'em Kodesh. Some of them are chol and some of them are Kodesh. Aleph Lamed Chol, Aleph Lamed, okay, is Elohim, is Chol. That's always talking about the other gods. But Yud Hey, when it actually has a reference to God with Yud Hey Vav Kei, Kodesh. Okay, so he says there are some references that are actually to God there. Chutz Mizesh Aleph Lamed Vu Kodesh. There's one place where it says Aleph Lamed in that whole section, which is actually Kodesh. What is it? And you'll see why. Obviously, Kodesh. Kol Yemei Hayot Beit Elohim b'Shilo. It's describing all the days that Beit Elohim was in Shiloh, meaning when the Mishkan was in Shiloh. Obviously, that's a reference to God. Kol Shemot Hamurim b'Givat Binyamin. This is a fascinating section. Okay, terrible section where we end up with a civil war at the very end of Sefer Shoftim. Okay, and we're going to see some of the psukim inside. Here we have a situation where the truth is, I don't want to read them all inside because we really don't have time, but I'll just summarize. You look in Perek Chet, starting from pasuk Yud Chet. Okay, so if you look there, Yud Chet, Kaf Gimel, and then Kaf Chet. There's 3 times the Jews turn to God, and they say, the first time they say, who should go to war first against the Binyaminites? And God answers back, Yehuda. Okay, by the way, it's Yud Ke Vav Ke here. Okay, pretty clear it's Hashem. Then they go to God a second, and then what happens? They actually get killed in battle, and they start crying to God, and then they go to God a second time, and they say, should we go to war? And God says, right, they say, they cry before God, but we continue to go to war with them. And Hashem says, Alu elav, yeah, go against him. And then more of them die. Okay, which is very strange. Why is God telling them to go if they're going to die? The third time, it says, actually has a much more elaborate description, and that's why we're going to see there's a possible machloket here. They call to God, okay, they ask God. They're the Aaron Abris, it says, and Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aharon, who's the Kohen, is there. Sounds much more, important than the previous ones. And then it says, should I go or should I stop? Meaning, like, really, should we go to war? And then they get the answer, go and tomorrow you will win. And then they do. So there's a whole question here. Did they really ask God before? Because how could God have answered them, go, and then they got killed? Maybe it wasn't God they were asking. And also noting the difference in the last pasuk, where all of a sudden you have the Aram Bri, you have Pinchas. It sounds very different. And it's the only time they really end up winning. So that's the background you need for this section. So now we say, Kol hashemot amurim b'givat binyamin, Rabbi Eliezer omer chol. He says they're not God, except for the last one. Rabbi Yeshua omer kodesh. So Amar Rabbi Eliezer, what God promised and go to war and then didn't do? It can't be that. That would be blasphemous to say that God said go to war and then they die. Doesn't make any sense. Amar Rabbi Yeshua, what do you mean? He did exactly what he said. They didn't say, should we go to war? Are we going to win or are we going to be beaten? They didn't ask. They didn't ask the proper question. Only at the end they asked, and then God says, oh, you'll go and you'll win. It was their fault for not asking properly. They said, who should go first? God said, who should go first? They said, should we battle? Yes, you should battle. I didn't say you're going to win. You didn't ask me if you're going to win or not. Okay? So, only in the last time when they asked properly, then God answered them the right way. Okay, and that's that last time. Now we're moving on to the next one. Kol Shlomo. Now we're off of names of God, but not really. Kol Shlomo hamilim b'shir shirim kodesh. Okay, look when it says Shir Shirim Asher Shlomo, first pasuk. Shlomo is God. Shir lemisha shalom shalom. Okay, Shlomo is a reference to the one who peaces with him. That's God. Chutz mizeh, except for one. Karmisha li lefanai ha'elef lecha Shlomo. Shlomo lididei u'matayim lenotchim et piryo Rabbanan. Okay, ha'elef lecha Shlomo is 1,000 for you, Shlomo, and 2,000 are left for me. God takes 6 of them for his service, so to speak. Okay, this is a bad topic right now about Giyus Charedim and all that. Are there exemptions for the war? This sounds like there's a 6. The Talmud Chachamim, they stay with God, and the others, work for Shlomo. There's an exemption for those who learn Torah. But some people understand that pasuk as chol. Some people say there's even another pasuk of Shlomo that's chol. Hinemi tatosha l'Shlomo shishim. Okay, there were shishim giburim around his 60 strong men around his bed, and that's actually Shlomo. Now, there's a problem with this because this says av zeh v'lo mevayeach. In other words, the Yesh Omrim sound like they're saying both psukim are Shlomo. The problem is, right, the one we said about the Karmisha Li and Hinemi Tato. But Elahada Amr Shmuel, but Shmuel says Malchuta dekat lachad mishita ba'alma lo me'ansha. That Shmuel understands the pasuk about Shlomo differently. The earlier one, he says that earlier pasuk is actually saying what now. Before everyone said the one Shlomo about the 1,600, the 200 and 1,000 was talking specifically about Shlomo. Everybody said that. The problem is now the second opinion was coming to say that and this are Shlomo. Shmuel's opinion is going to be according to nobody, because Shmuel's opinion is that the first pasuk of the Kerem, the vineyard, and the 1,200 is actually talking about God, and he understands this totally differently. Ha'elef l'cha Shlomo l'machuta d'rakia. Ha'elef l'cha Shlomo means 1,000 for God. Shlomo is God. And the king, in other words, a king who takes, and that's what we said before, the king takes 1/6 of the people to work for the king. That's okay. But the rest belong to God. Don't get to work for the king. Okay, the king doesn't have the right to take more than 1/6 of the people. And then, doesn't make any sense, right? Machuta, that's Machuta Da'ara. That's for the king in the land. So Shmuel, because Tanakama said that pasuk is Shlomo, and the second opinion said that pasuk is Shlomo, and the next pasuk is Shlomo. But nobody thinks that pasuk isn't Shlomo. So Elahachi Kamar. So they changed the Yesh Omrim. Yesh Omrim zeh kodesh v'zeh chol demitato. Shmuel damar ki Yesh Omrim. The Yesh Omrim say no. That pasuk was kodesh, just like Shmuel, and the second pasuk about the mitah shel Shlomo is actually Shlomo. Okay, and then we just change. Kol Malchai, and now we're moving to another word. So we went from God's names to Shlomo, and now to Melech. Any Melech that Daniel said, anytime he said Malchut, he meant Chol, like kingdom, because he talked a lot about kingdoms of different kingdoms. Chutz mizeshu kodesh, except for this one. Ant Malka Melech Machaya Diala Shmaya Malchuta Chasna V'Takva V'Yikar Yavlach. Okay, I am the king, Melech Machem Lachim. Okay, this is a reference, obviously, to the king of all kings. That's God. Some people say this pasuk is kodesh. Mari is a name of my master, which is God. Okay, the chalom, this was this dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. And the question is this Mari word Nebuchadnezzar, or is it God? So he says, this one's also God. How do I know? Because it says, your chalom is for those who hate you, meaning you're going to destroy your enemies. Now, Leman da'amar, leman ka'ama, isa kadatach Nebuchadnezzar. Who is this said to? If you say Nebuchadnezzar kamarle, samvate ma'ininu Yisrael, melech alai lihu Yisrael, what Daniel will be cursing the Jewish people? And who are the sonim of Nebuchadnezzar if not the Jews? So it's saying that your dream is talking about how you're going to destroy the Jews. Daniel wouldn't want to say that, right? That's cursing the Jews. Tanakam samar. Sonei Israel ika sonei umot olam leika. Tanakam who holds it. So therefore, obviously, it's talking about God, and it's the sonim, which is Nebuchadnezzar himself, will be destroyed. The dream is that you will be destroyed. But the Tanakam who thinks it's talking about Nebuchadnezzar is saying, wait, it's if Nebuchadnezzar has enemies among the Jews or his enemies, what you think he doesn't have other nations that are his enemies? And maybe it's saying the Chalom is for your enemies, other enemies, not the Jewish people. Okay, so two ways to understand that. ובכל הכינויים הרי אלו חייבים. ורמיני, ייתן השם אותך לעלה ולשבועה. מה תלמוד לומר? הלא כבר נאמר, השביע הכהן את האישה בשבועת העלה. Okay, now we're going to the Sota. It says, okay, and we're going to bring a contradiction from this to the Mishnah, but let's first see this source. God will make you an Allah and a shvuah, but it also says already yishbiah kohen et haisha b'shvuat Allah. So why does it repeat this about there's two oaths here? So why is that? Right? Yeah, yafeh. It's in our parsha this week. Thank you, Miriam, for pointing that out. This week's parsha. Lefisha ne'amar b'sham'a kol Allah ne'amar kan Allah v'ne'amar la'lan Allah ma la'lan shvuah af kan shvuah. So it added this extra Allah to teach you that we're going to learn from the Sota to our case, which is what? Just like there, it's b'shvuah av kan b'shvuah and ma la'lan b'shem av kan b'shem. There you use the Shem HaMefurash of God. Also here, you have to use the Shem HaMefurash of God. Now that goes against our Mishnah, because our Mishnah said, even a kinoi. So Amar Abayla, Kasha Rabbi Chanina bar Idi, Ha Rabbanan. Okay, don't worry. These are two different opinions. Tanya, Rabbi Chanina bar Idi Omer, Ho'il v'amra Torah yishava v'al tishava, kalel v'al tikalel. The Torah gave you places where you're supposed to take an oath, like Shvuat Hashem tiyeh ben shnehem. And there's, you claim it was stolen, you're a shomer, and you claim it was stolen, you have to take an oath. Okay, then we have al tishava, don't swear my name falsely. We have kalel va'al tikalel, you're supposed to be lekalel et hasotah, and you're supposed to not curse God, not curse your parents, not curse other people. Ma'isha, so now we're going to make a comparison between all these. Ma'ishava b'shem, af lo tishava b'shem. Ma'kilel b'shem, af lo tikalel b'shem. Okay, just like he shavas with God's name, right? The shvuah for the sota. Also, the shvuah not is also not with God's name. And just like lekalel is b'shem Hashem, to take this curse, right, is b'shem Hashem. Af lo tikalel b'shem. Sorry, hishava b'shem is lo tisat shem Hashem l'chashav. Okay, so, or lo tishava b'shmi l'sheker. And the kala is the sota. V'Rabbanan, so that's one opinion. And that matches the Braita we just saw. V'Rabbanan, okay, we're going to stop here, actually, and we're going to get to Rabbanan tomorrow. Okay, we really don't have time, so we'll stop right here. Let's just review quickly our daf, and we'll finish that up tomorrow. So we started our daf at the end of yesterday, what they mocked him for in Israel, which we didn't really figure out in the end. Then Rabbi Shimon, we went to these 5 cases. There's no Shevuot Edut, and then we went through all the details and kind of really what the source of the Torah was for those. Then we went into this whole thing of the language you use for the Shevuah, and then we saw you had to use the name of God, or at least a kinoi of the name of God. That got us on a tangent about, are those really all kinuyim of God? What about when it comes to erasing God's name? It's not the same thing. And then we compared, and we got into this whole tangent about people using names that could be God's name, could be understood as different names. And in the Tanach, there's many references that you think it's God, it's not really God, and maybe, or there's debates about certain references. Are they referring to God, or are they not? And then we got to this issue of kinuyim, and there seems to be this disagreement, these two approaches, whether the oath, the Shevuot Edut, and also, right, some of the other things, like the cursing God, is it only with the Shem HaMefurash, or is it also with a kinoi? And we'll get back to that and start up with that tomorrow. Wishing everyone a good day.